Demographic changes have profound effects on all sectors of the economy. And with us now at the NZZ Capital Market Forum is Professor Dr. Laurence Kotlikoff of Boston University. Larry, what are the repercussions of demographic changes for the financial industry?
Well, the fiscal problems in the different countries are going to really be impacted by the aging of society. The U.S. is a perfect example. We have enormous liabilities, obligations. They're called entitlements to pay for the retirees that are now there and are coming in huge numbers, their pensions and their health care benefits. So these obligations of the government swamp the official debt. So the U.S. is actually broke, and anybody who's buying U.S. bonds could get into trouble because of that.
Do the effects of demographic changes vary in different countries?
Yeah, you have countries that have their pension systems and healthcare systems under control, so that the demographics are not going to make for large obligations to the federal government or to the next generation. So, for example, Australia has had a pension reform way in the past, and they're in very good shape now. Canada, New Zealand, Chile, all these countries are fiscally in very good shape and aren't going to be affected by the demographics, whereas the UK, the US, Germany to a significant extent, other countries in Europe, they're going to all get hurt.
So there are obviously some countries where the policymakers really identify and use the demographic data, and other countries where that's not really happening.
Yeah, for example, Norway. Norway has this huge amount of oil wealth, and they were smart enough to try and think through what will this mean for the next generation if we spend all that money now. So the Norwegians put together a oil trust fund. It's called a generational fund to protect some of this money, resource for future Norwegians. And the Dutch now are thinking about pension reform. Now they're thinking about the demographics and how are they going to treat today's older people, today's middle-aged people, but also tomorrow's middle-aged people, in other words, today's children, in that reform.
And Credit Suisse identifies demographics as one of the mega trends that's likely to impact societies for a long time to come. How can investors profit?
Well, they have to think about, first of all, the fiscal implications of the demographics and stay away from the long-term bonds of countries like the U.S. that are going to be in very massive trouble because of the demographics interacting with the benefit levels. So what's the U.S. going to do? They're going to print a lot of money to pay these bills, and that will lead to inflation. And if you buy bonds, you'll get paid back in watered-down dollars. So being careful about the fiscal issues here, then thinking about, gee, what is it that older people are going to be buying? They're going to be buying health care, they're going to be buying perhaps vacation homes, they might need nursing homes, they may need walkers to walk around. So things like that, to try and anticipate the consumption bundle of the elderly.
And speaking of the elderly, ageing societies have come under the microscope here at the forum today. What problems do they cause for financial markets?
Well, financial markets might get the wrong impression about an economy like Japan, for example. It's not just aging, but it's also going to experience a major reduction in population. And other countries like Russia and Italy, the populations are going to drop dramatically. And as a consequence, the reported growth rates will be much lower than in other countries. Then all of a sudden you can think, well, the Japanese economy is not doing well because they're not growing, whereas the U.S. population is going to increase by about a third over the century. Massive increase in population. So we're going to be growing just because of the population in terms of absolute GDP. Japan's going to be shrinking in terms of its GDP, and people might think, well, Japan is not a place to invest in. That would be the wrong conclusion, because one needs to really look at growth in output per person and adjust for the demographics. So Japan might actually underlyingly look in much better shape than it appears.
So just to sum up then, what are 2 or 3 of the big changes you think we'll likely see with regard to demographics over the coming decade?
Well, we're going to have, in absolute numbers, a very huge increase in population in the U.S., a significant reduction in population in China over time. In Europe, there's going to be a reduction in population. Russia is also going to shrink. And Africa is going to expand tremendously in terms of population. So the developed world is going to shrink compared to the developing world. So that's a big mega trend here. There's also just the fiscal issues, again, that are enormous, and they're not being resolved in the US and other countries. They're not being resolved quick enough. It's one thing to have a pension reform, but is it significant enough? Is it fast enough to really matter? Or a health care reform? In the US, we're not thinking like adults because we don't seem to care about our kids. So those two things, and then also, what is it that the elderly are going to be buying? What is it going to be? How will things be different in terms of the goods and services that are being produced? Part of that is going to be catering to the elderly's needs.
Thanks a lot, Larry.
Hey, my pleasure.